All right, welcome everyone. This is another episode in our Chronicles on Paganism. My name is Anthony Costello. I'm the president of the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics. And I'm joined today by Joshua Farris, Father Farris, to some of us, from Soul Science Ministries, and Carl Teichrib from Orbis Century, joining us all the way up from the Great White North, Manitoba, Canada. In today's episode, which will be the fourth in this series on neo-paganism, occult, magic, and various other topics related to those themes, we're going to be talking about Panpsychism, a new shift in philosophy that has taken root over the last few decades. So I'm going to open up with just a general introduction here to our theme, and then we're going to get into the substance of our matter today. For generations, our academic institutions, especially in the English-speaking world, seemed to be locked into a view of reality that presupposed a strict form of materialism. Matter was understood to be not just the only substance, but was interpreted as impersonal, unconscious stuff, blind forces and subatomic particles that could be analyzed, quantified, and exhaustively described through the methods of our natural sciences and a proper application of mathematics. This metaphysical assumption tended to dominate other academic fields, acting as the starting point for many other areas of inquiry: physics, chemistry, biology, even sociology, economics, and politics. Human beings may be alive, but, it was said, our conscious existence was pure accident, and our first-person experiences but a surprising byproduct of random physical and impersonal activity. However, recently, there has been a major shift among philosophers and even some scientists away from this kind of strict materialism to one that takes seriously things like mentality, mental properties, qualia, and other phenomena that seem impossible to reduce down to blind, impersonal forces or particles. Idealism is back as a viable metaphysical candidate, as well as panpsychism, a view of reality that sees mind as primary and finds consciousness as fundamental. In this fourth episode of Paganism and the Re-Enchanted World, we are going to look at these new trends in the philosophy of mind, in physics, and in theology, and try to understand how they intersect with a more pantheistic or pagan conception of the world. Joshua, we're going to start with you on this one. This is your field. This is an area you've been working in for a while. So let's talk about the kind of maybe materialism that seemed to dominate the academy for such a long time, and maybe how this sort of shift towards these new or different conceptions of fundamental reality have kind of started to emerge in the last few decades. What has your experience been? What have you been seeing in the academy?
I'll say up front, I haven't. I've been thinking about a lot of these issues in terms of consciousness, feel mind. I see these as certainly having tremendous implications and applications to all sorts of issues that I think we'll maybe touch on today, and we've maybe touched on lightly in previous episodes. So at one level, consciousness seems like a fairly niche topic, and it kind of is, but it also and it's perceived as such, but it also has these massive implications. Again, particularly, it has implications for the cosmos and how it is that we understand the cosmos and our relationship to it. And certainly in the history of consciousness studies, particularly in neuroscience, in academic circles, I'm speaking in academic circles primarily right now, going back to the early 1900s, I think it's important. It's an important benchmark to go back around that time, because especially in the West and in Europe, there was a dominant kind of materialistic frame. You might even say more basic than that, a kind of naturalistic frame, even crudely speaking, kind of scientistic frame with respect to data that overlaps with the mind and the brain. And of course, this discussion goes back even earlier in the modern discussion, of which the modern discussion in the early modern philosophy, going back to Francis Bacon, especially in Rene Descartes, huge figures that will come up again in this discussion in numerous ways. But in the early 1900s, you have a dominant sort of fixed kind of attitude, or you might call it an epistemic attitude toward consciousness in the mind, that's dominated by a kind of scientism and even a kind of, some would call it logical positivism, that certainly dominated in the early 1900s, where any sort of claim about mental or supernatural agency or any claim whatsoever had to find some sort of empirical verification if it was going to be demonstrated as true. During this time, you had logical behaviorism as well, that was dominating much of the discussion in neuroscience. And then you have other developments toward different variations of physicalism, certainly that are still around today, and certainly were even prominent in discussions in the 90s, 80s, and 90s under following people like Daniel Dennett, who affirms what you might call a physicalist eliminativist view, or some might call it an illusionist view. That is, that consciousness itself is not real, it's an illusion, or consciousness itself is not causally active in the world, so consciousness has no reality, so hence the name eliminativism. Consciousness itself can be, for somebody like Daniel Dennett, generated by brain processes solely, and the mind for him would be somehow truly reducible. So this is an important term in much of the philosophy of mind discussions. Reductionism. So in other words, if we could take certain mental causes and we could reduce it by providing a sort of explanation that is solely given in terms of triggers and pulleys or neurons firing, then we can provide a sufficient or comprehensive explanation of those appearances, or those conscious appearances. So someone like Daniel Dennett would affirm that while there might be appearances or consciousness as appearances, these are in fact illusions. They are not real. There is certainly no inner subject beyond physical organization. So you still have these sort of prominent views that were really quite dominant in the early 1900s, leading into the mid-1900s, regarding the discussions on the relationship between the brain and the mind. So many would affirm something like some sort of identity, what's called identity physicalism. The idea that consciousness itself, or mind or mental events themselves, are, hence the name, they are identical to brain states, or identical to neurons or some part of the brain that comprehensively explains the conscious events themselves. So you have other eliminative materialists like Daniel Dennett, following the famous Churchlands, who would affirm that our common sense psychology is actually, quote, false and radically misleading. So these ideas that there are beliefs, desires, the inner self, these are really fictions for them. But In the, I think, arguably, you start seeing shifts away from these more radical trends within neuroscience and philosophy of mind on physicalism, still around today for sure, but it's certainly becoming, uh, or it seems there has been a significant shift. And some of that shift has begun, it seems, back in the 70s, really with famous articles. There's famous articles from the likes of Thomas Nagel. Mm-hmm. Thomas Nagel and his famous article that's probably maybe the most cited paper in philosophy of mind. It's certainly in the top 10. What it's like to be a bat, a famous paper, which I'm sure we've all heard of at some point. What is it like to be a bat? Anyway, so he's raising this question about qualia, or qualitative experience. So for Thomas Nagel, he didn't come around to this point till later, maybe in the 90s, certainly with his book in the 2000s, Mind and Cosmos. He comes around kind of full sail to this position of rejecting kind of a comprehensive naturalism and rejecting what, depending on how you define naturalism, what is entailed by naturalism, this kind of radical physicalism, that conscious mental states are identical or reducible to brain states themselves. And so he would say that consciousness is the most conspicuous obstacle to a comprehensive naturalism. And this shift has, like, that sentiment or that attitude has been around in a lot of the literature for a while, but it's really kind of taking quite a bit of root now, I think, in a lot of the discussions in philosophy of mind, as well as in the neuroscientific discussions, which is setting up, so I know this is a lot, but this is setting up the framework for some of these trends that are now occurring and kind of dominating these discussions on consciousness presently. So Thomas Nagel, certainly an important figure, wherein in his famous book, Mind and Cosmos, again, he argues that materialistic naturalism is almost certainly false. Like, it's just not even a viable position anymore to take seriously because of the stubborn nature of consciousness, qualities, qualitative experiences, even subjectivity. Naturalism just cannot explain subjectivity itself, right? So you have other figures in recent history that have been along a similar trajectory. Of course, David Chalmers with his famous hard problem for consciousness. The hard problem for consciousness is how it is that you might explain the inner life, the qualitative inner life, how you would explain that by way of physical processes. There seems to be in kind of a gap that is that we can't sort of traverse. These are just radically different, and so this lends itself to what philosophers have called a kind of irreducibility thesis, that there is an irreducibility of the consciousness to the material. And you might say the other way as well, that the material is irreducible to consciousness, although that's less certain and less. What is difficult is to reduce consciousness or mental states back to brain states or neural states. Mm-hmm. And so there is an irreducibility problem that seems to be present. So he doesn't abandon naturalism completely. He's still working within a broadly kind of naturalistic framework. He does reject or move beyond certain stricter, stronger versions of physicalism, certainly the reductive physicalisms, because, right, he's affirming an irreducibility thesis that seems to be following from the hard problem of consciousness. So you have other figures that come along even more recently, like Galen Strawson, who is now affirming, and this is where we start getting into the question of panpsychism. And panpsychism has kind of had it's been around for a while. Of course, in previous episodes we referenced figures like William James as a prominent earlier figure of maybe something like panpsychism. So it's been around. It's been in the historical kind of discussions for a while. It wasn't certainly prominent in the 1900s up until more recently in the sort of philosophical discussions on the subject. Of course, and you even have Bertrand Russell, the famous analytic philosopher that we've referenced more recently, who seems to be affirming something like this position, although what he's exactly affirming is less clear in his writings. I've perused a lot of his writings, not an expert on Russell. There's a lot of writings, but even in Russell, his panpsychism, or what some would call his neutral monism, is the view that there are these irreducible mental events and there's these irreducible physical events. And at some level, they exist, and they're kind of brute facts of the world that we take for granted. We can't get rid of them. And so Russell has often been claimed in the camp more recently of kind of panpsychism, broadly construed. So we could put a much finer point on some of the nuances here. And for the academics who are listening, I'll try to do that briefly. But of course, there's more nuance that could be said. But the point is that many panpsychists claim him as one of their own.
Right.
And so Galen Strawson comes on the scene with what he calls real physicalism. So in the 90s as well as in the 2000s, Galen Strawson's an important metaphysician who's moving in this direction, who rejects a kind of reductive physicalist view in favor of some version of panpsychism that he calls kind of a real physicalism. So he's still operating out of a naturalistic frame, and he's still operating, you might even say, coupled with that, out of a secularist frame. There's no mention of God here. There's no recourse to God as an explanation of consciousness, right? But he would affirm something like this. He argues that physicalism, if it's true, and consciousness exists, then consciousness must already be a fundamental feature of matter. So this is already taken in the direction of panpsychism, or at least some version of panpsychism. But it's very clear. This is certainly on his version. It seems it's not a version of dualism. Kind of, if we think crudely of dualism, I affirm some kind of dualism. We can talk about that more later. But crudely, Cartesian dualism, that there are these not just irreducible events of mental stuff or mental acts, events, or irreducible physical events, but they're actually bearers of those events, or substances, as philosophers would call them. There's parts that are irreducible themselves. So there's something like a mental substance, or even what older religious people would call, or Christians today might call, or theists might call, substances or souls. Souls as substances that are the primary property bearers of mental events themselves, and physical events themselves are distinct from that. It's not that. It's also not theism. But consciousness now is built back into matter itself. So painting a picture, we're going to get around to this. The way we're asking this question it's not normally framed this way in the literature. So it takes a bit of it took some adjustment for me to think about it this way. But this is not only fascinating, but it has, I think, massive implications for how it is that we're understanding reality. Okay, so then Philip Goff. Okay, I'm going to come around so
this is very recent now, yeah.
Okay, yes. So much more recent, Philip Goff. Philip Goff has certainly become a famous philosopher engaged in wider discussions, pretty wide discussions that have lots of cosmic implications, from quantum mechanics, cosmology studies, to physics, and the like. His famous book, this is the book that's always referred to. It's not his first book. He had a more academic book before that doesn't get referenced, but it's very technical. Um, is Galileo's Error. And so he tells the story of the history of philosophy and consciousness in a different way. It's an interesting way. There's a lot of plausibility to it, and there's a lot that we as dualists or even we as theists should be, I think grateful for, that we can be appreciative of, and we need to critically engage with ourselves. In his Galileo's Error, he's putting forward the theory, and this has becoming much more in vogue over the last certainly 10, 20 years, again, as panpsychism has come on the scene and has taken seriously mental events, consciousness, what it is like. So what is likeness? What do I mean by that? Maybe I should step back briefly. What it is likeness? I mean, you might say that, oh, I haven't even mentioned Mary. We should mention Mary in there, right? The famous thought experiment. What's it like to be Mary?
Oh, yeah. Who was that? Not John.
That's a famous paper as well, Frank Jackson. I mean, it would be in the top 10 of cited papers you have to refer to if you're going to do any sort of survey of the literature on this subject. Yeah, Frank Jackson. Howard Robinson argues. He's another, he came up with a similar argument. He came up with it first, he argues. But anyway, Frank Jackson got famous for it. But it's this idea that there are certain kinds of explanations. There are certain kinds of explanations of data, so say physics of light or the neuroscience of light, that give certain levels of explanation, but they never quite give an explanation of, say, what it is like to experience color. And this is the whole thought experiment that's famous to what it's like to be Mary, who's this, famous neuroscientist who lives in a black and white room, who studied everything about the nature of color and could explain everything in terms of the neuroscience and the physics of it all. But until she actually goes out into the world to experience, say, the blue sky, she doesn't know what it's like or what it is to have an experience of the blue sky. That's a wholly novel quality itself. And so Philip Goff takes that and says, well, what we have in the history of the philosophy of consciousness is this problem going back to Galileo of quantities. And I think this basic. I think there's a lot of truth in what he's saying here. Like, quantities provide some level of explanation. We can give mathematical numbers maybe to certain phenomena in the world. And we can quantify it in a certain way, and maybe do some rigorous kind of empirical work on it. And but on the other side of it, the other side is quite clearly for Goff is that there are these qualities in the world. Qualities are not the same thing as quantities, and this becomes an important kind of thesis in his book, that there's an error that has dominated a great deal of the discussion surrounding consciousness in neuroscience and the like, that still predominates in many much of the academic literature, neuroscientific academic literature on consciousness still, but qualities are not reducible to quantities, and there's something that's totally amiss in the discussion when we don't have qualities. And I think he's right. I mean, some of the most important or interesting things about the world have to do with qualities. My experience of chocolate ice cream, or even more rich or rigorous or complicated, my experiences of my wife are far more interesting than the numbers that I might give to the hairs on her head, or the genetic kind of mapping that is intrinsic in her body or something like that. There's something far more interesting about that. And so Philip Goff and these panpsychists are taking seriously, once again, qualities, qualitative experience. And this leads us or moves us in the direction of taking seriously, once again, subjects or subjectivity itself. And so I think this is a good thing. But until early on, of course, for Goff, he's still operating certainly out of a naturalistic frame. He's certainly operating out of a secularist frame. He's not moving toward theism in his original book, or Galileo's Error. He gestures maybe in that way in his more recent book, Why? And of course, he's come on the scene and claimed the term theism or even Christian theism, right? What he calls heretical Christianity. We can talk about that in a moment. But he certainly is moving in that direction because he's seeing, after his book Why, or within the context of Why, he's seeing the necessity for explanations and cosmic explanations as having some sort of recourse to mind itself. Mind becomes pretty central, paradigmatic in how he explains certain data, particularly the fine-tuning data of the world, which he finds particularly compelling, and that's what moves him in the direction of some sort of cosmic mind, what he's now calling some kind of theism or heretical theism. It certainly is at least heretical theism, but we can talk about that in a moment. He's saying that, but I do want to emphasize his move toward qualities, the importance of that, like the openness of that, and the fact that in this narrative, as I am understanding it, especially in the context of these academic discussions on consciousness, there has been this already kind of presumed epistemic stance towards some kind of naturalistic secularism. And so the dominant kind of discussion leaders who are in this discussion and leading it and pushing it forward and moving in the direction of panpsychism, the whole narrative predominantly is coming out of a naturalistic, secularistic frame. And as they're doing it, they're doing so in a way that is coming to terms with the reality that physicalism is insufficient as an explanation. And they're not happy with it. They're, you might say, even disenchanted with it. And I think there are lots of parallels here that we can begin to draw in the literature in terms of why they're disillusioned with physicalism now. And that seems to be more the dominant stance that's growing right now. There's a disillusionment with physicalism, and paralleled with that, I think there's a disenchantment with the physical world itself. So whereas the physical world, as it were, explained by kind of naturalistic physicalism, gives us a solely kind of, often this is the picture, a machine-like picture of the world, right? Oftentimes Descartes is the whipping boy who's straddled with these, like he created, right? I think so, but he created all these problems, right? I mean, you have the soul, like the emotional part, and then you have like the machine, and they're connected somehow in some sort of I don't know, however they're connected. But what you have later in modernity and in recent history is, rather than taking up the soul and consciousness as a reality, you have a kind of shaving off of that. Let's simplify it, right? Let's do the Occam's razor. That's inappropriate, but let's do the Occam razor and just cut it off. Just cut it off, and we have a machine, and we can kind of control this machine. There's certain benefits within kind of science when taking that approach. Obviously, there were lots of discoveries that occurred as a result of taking a much more strict kind of scientific, or what some would call methodological naturalistic stance on the the data that's being studied. But again, now we're seeing like the massive limitations of that particular kind of framework for studying the world and the cosmos, particularly the consciousness. So again, in and we'll come back around. So hopefully we're beginning to see maybe the kind of the narrative, kind of the dominant kind of shifts, the characteristics of these discussions surrounding consciousness, certainly the implications that consciousness has for the cosmos itself and a meaningful reality. And so with this disillusionment with physicalism, there's also this parallel disenchantment with the physical nature machine itself that we experience, that is insufficient as an explanation of the whole world and what it is to be in this world, or what it means.
Say very quickly that just 8 years ago, when I was in philosophy of mind class with the great J.P. Moreland, we were still primarily dealing with the reductionists as our main sort of nemesis or foes. The Churchlands, the Dan Dennett's, that was still seemed to be, at least at this particular Christian seminary and in this context, who we had to develop our apologetics in order to answer. We were still trying to answer that kind of eliminativist mind view of reducing everything down to brain states, this kind of hard physicalism. And you've just given us a sense of how that is changing. That doesn't mean that those folks are still not around and that they're not players, and that they're probably also trying to make their responses to these more recent moves like panpsychism. Although the Churchlands, I think, are older, and we know Dan Dennett passed just recently, at least his body, if not his self. But then also, it struck me a few years ago. I was at a Discovery Institute event in Dallas, Texas, and I was bringing this up to some of the speakers who were very aware of and amenable to Thomas Nagel's work in Mind and Cosmos, because this would seem to at least offset that reductionistic view of matter. But then I raised the concern of, yes, but we should be careful to think that that will just translate into some kind of theistic or a kind of intelligent design view where the designer is transcendent to nature. And we should be aware of this move towards something like a more immanent kind of agency in the material world itself that can do the kinds of things that an intelligent designer could do. And I think panpsychism was on my mind as I made that point. Okay, Carl. Okay, as somebody who's been living, moving, and having his being with people who don't assume any kind of hard reductionistic view of matter, but that certainly take matter seriously and even as a kind of an agent of its own. I'd love to hear your comments on what Joshua just sort of laid out for us.
Well, my hand was going up. I was like, hey, questions. I got questions. So I'm gonna take a different role. I'm gonna assume a different role with this. I'm gonna ask Joshua some questions because I think this is a fascinating subject. I mean, my goodness, we're diving into territory that I think, I know has had a huge impact on the academic side, but I don't think the person on the street, for the most part, thinks about it from a day-to-day point of view. So I'm going to ask some really basic questions, and I'm hoping that might open up a space for some conversations. I guess one of the things that, first of all, strikes me is, and Joshua, what is consciousness?
There you go. There's an easy one. A softball question for
and
you.
Then, are we talking in terms of panpsychism? Is this a bottom to top approach? Because if everything is imbued with consciousness or some type of spark or essence, are we now looking at this becoming, let's say, from the realm of molecular, a molecular atomic state, moving up into higher orders higher complexity? Is this a bottom to top approach? So those are the two questions that popped into my mind.
At the center of most of the religious perspectives that are like kind of gaining ground today, consciousness is somehow playing a pretty pivotal role in how they're understanding the relationship between themselves and the world. So consciousness becomes a window into, I think, an important window into reality. There are common descriptions of what consciousness is. Consciousness is described by certain properties. It's described by, at least from our vantage point, privacy. Consciousness has the characteristic of being transparent. It has an internal component. I look inward. Consciousness is basic to my own introspection. If I can introspect about my own mental ideas or emotional states, if there's any possibility of doing that, then consciousness is presupposed. I have some sort of inner way to look at myself in a way that Carl and Anthony cannot. You can infer certain things about my internal states, my mental, emotional states based upon how I behave or based upon things that I say. But you don't have certainly direct, this is another characteristic, you don't have direct access to my own conscious states of awareness. That's something that is not available to you, or at least not accessible in any direct way. So those are ways of describing consciousness. Consciousness is something that is so kind of basic to being persons that it's difficult to define, but it's also it's so fundamental to who we are. So mental events themselves are properties of a conscious subject. You might say, I'm a conscious subject. I'm presuming that you're a conscious subject and Anthony's a conscious subject who has mental events similar to the way that I do. And those mental events are things or events that I don't have direct access to, but I do have direct access to my own mental events, or at least not necessarily awareness, but I have direct access to it. So those would be ways of describing consciousness. It is the fundamentally basic property or event that makes experiences possible.
Okay. No, thank you. This is fascinating. So, I mean, it's a hard thing to land on, precisely because it has a quality to it that is inward. It's how do you measure this? How do you quantify it? It reminds me of a conversation I heard back in 2013. I attended the Global Future 2045 Congress. It was the largest transhumanist event in the world at the time, and we had the big conversation that was in process at that point was mapping the brain. If we could map the brain and have a full mapping of its neural connections, we could therefore understand consciousness, basically backward engineer the brain and potentially upload ourselves into a mainframe, upload our consciousness. And that was the big hope or the anticipation that here we're going to escape this problem of having these mortal bodies that die, and we could maybe escape this material thing and have our consciousness uploaded and potentially live forever. But the big question was, and nobody had a solid answer, because I mean, it is a difficult thing to wrap your heads around. No pun intended. And that is that we couldn't answer what consciousness really was. And that became like a sticking point. We had one fellow, I can't remember the gentleman's name, he's a neuroscientist, and he got up and he said to the effect of, hey, we have remapped the roundworm. We understand it neurally, we understand it backwards and forwards. It has 302 neural connectors. We've reversed it, we've studied it, we've mapped the whole thing. We can dissect it, We can study it, but we still don't know what makes it alive.
Mm.
We still don't know what gives it life. We still don't understand this thing of life. So if we can't understand something that basic, how are we going to grasp the concept of consciousness especially with a human being with, what do we have, billions of neural connections, not just 302?
Mm.
And it kind of blew me away. I was sitting there because I'm surrounded by literally the world's leading experts on neuroscience and artificial intelligence and all these conversations that were happening back then. And what struck me was the words from Scripture that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And it was like, okay, thank you, Lord. There is a complexity to our experience that is so deep and so profound that the best minds in the world cannot really nail this down. It's like trying to nail Jello to a wall. And to me, that was a fascinating admission on their part, that we don't totally grasp what this is, to the point where we can be able to now, let's say, use it like a tool or have some utilitarian function with our consciousness. So that kind of, that definitely is for me, it was an interesting takeaway. But then the question of course, looking at this from that perspective of panpsychism, is this a bottoms up approach versus maybe the concepts of cosmopsychism, where it's a top-down approach. The universe is all conscious, right, and then everything filters down until finally, all of a sudden, at the molecular level, you discover that everything is conscious. Whereas panpsychism says, or seems to say, it begins at the smallest elements and then moves up with complexity.
Yeah, can I jump in there? Yeah, there's a lot you just said there. Maybe the scripture verse, "We are fearfully and wonderfully made." Yeah, I mean that that should be maybe the theme that we should come back to throughout the episode. I mean, I think that as I've studied it, I think that's a really deep verse that takes on layers of meaning as I engage with this literature. It comes back to my memory over and over again. Of course, consciousness is something that is elusive to define. I mean, things are generally hard to define themselves oftentimes, but of course, all the more so at one level, it should be expected when it comes to consciousness as something that is so central and basic to much of reality that it would be hard to define. It's understandable at one level. We can describe it in certain ways because we have first-person experiences, I think, of consciousness. It's so basic to who we are, to who I am, and I assume to who you are, that it's hard to take. I mean, I should say it's easy to take for granted at one level. It's easy to take for granted, and not sufficiently appreciate the. And I want to use this term carefully, in a way that others would not imbue the same meaning. To appreciate the mystery of consciousness, and I don't hold all mysteries on the same level, and I don't mean mystery in the same way that maybe others would refer to consciousness as an easy way to get out of problems of consciousness. I mean, ultimately, the direction that I would go is arguments from consciousness actually lead us to theism. But that's a larger discussion. We haven't gone there, but we're gesturing in that direction, I think, based upon the verse that you just cited in the context of these discussions. So we're directly, we can't reject consciousness. It's properly kind of basic to who we are and how we experience the world and everything that we do in the world. It's not something that we can easily dismiss. And importantly, these many thinkers who are studying consciousness right now are, it seems, more sufficiently appreciating that fact. It's a stubborn fact that naturalism just cannot explain. Certainly naturalistic physicalism cannot explain. There's this fringe consciousness conference. In fact, I've heard of, a couple of people who work for a couple of foundations. They were planning to go to it, but it was canceled last minute because there's evidence that he was funding it. And it made me wonder, like, people think, like, why would Epstein fund a consciousness conference? That seems kind of weird. Like, that just seems arbitrary. What's up with that? And it may have something to do with this fascination with, again, trying to control consciousness and figure out how we can upload consciousness so that we can live forever in some digital immortality or something, some sort of transhumanist way that we could live forever. So at least that's what it led me to think. Maybe that's why he was interested in consciousness in part. He wanted to fund it for that purpose so that we could find some sort of way to control consciousness.
That's okay. Yeah, controlling consciousness. Golly. So, assuming again, the panpsychic perspective assumes that there are at least particles of consciousness or parts of consciousness. Everything assumes.
So let me define it. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you asked. That was the second question. I didn't define it. Yeah. So there's different versions of panpsychism.
Okay.
Again, going back to Bertrand Russell, a lot of it comes out of this discussion of neutral monism. Neutral monism is pretty unsatisfactory because neutral monism it just takes physical and mental events as kind of brute. And maybe that's as far as we can get. I don't think it is as far as we can get. We have other paradigms that seem to do a bit more work for us. So, and panpsychism tries to do more work for us than that. Panpsychism, there's lower bottom-up versions, as you mentioned, and there's top-down versions of panpsychism. Bottom-up versions, you might say, there's panpsychism says that everything is consciousness all the way down to the very particles, the physical particles themselves. Physical particles are conscious. Now, whether that means that the particles as they are physical are conscious, or there is some sort of additional thinginess or substance that is conscious that's somehow parallel with the particles. That's one question. And some would say there's kind of this pan-protopsychism or something, or this dispositional psychism that all the way down there is something extra in the material particles individually that are disposed toward consciousness, such that at certain levels of complexity, they just give rise to consciousness. There's another variation, you might say, maybe, that says that everything is qualitative and experiential. So all the way down to the very particles themselves, there are these quantities that we can count and empirically study. And then there's this internal thing, this qualitative experience. They are experientials or experienceables all the way down at the very bottom levels. Something like this was sort of Goff's view. And more recently in his Why book, he moves in a different direction. And he moves in the direction of what many call, as you referred to, cosmopsychism. And the view that the universe itself is conscious. And so here we start getting into discussions about the relationship between life and consciousness, which is central to this more fundamental discussion surrounding kind of versions of paganism, certainly. And so now he affirms some kind of cosmopsychism as the best explanation. I remember discussing this with him a few years ago and pressing him and saying, well, depending on how you go, what direction you go in, you could be a theist of a sort, or you could be a pantheist, but it's not clear. Well, in more recent history, he's actually said he's okay with the term pantheism. And most definitions of at least pantheism, I think we would legitimately say those are kind of oftentimes nature-centric, and they are distinct from what we would consider traditional or classical Christianity or classical Christian theism. Quite clearly, they are incompatible, right? I think we would I think we could safely say that. And I'm using classical in a broad sense. So before somebody critiques me, a broader sense, right?
Yeah.
So that would be a more top-down version. But rather than there being some transcendent reality that's outside of the universe, the cosmos in which we live and experience, the world or universe in which we live and experience itself is alive, and even alive in a divine way. It is the ultimate explanation of the universe. And so this is where we start getting into broader metaphysical questions about the cosmos and how it is that it explains itself. And so here we are, it seems, moving in a very quickly into a direction of some version of pantheism, pantheistic paganism, that sees the universe itself as alive, divine, self-mobilizing, or maybe has the kind of the inner potential for kind of what's the right term? Help me out here.
Self-organization.
Self-organization.
Yeah.
Rather than being imbued by
and self-creation, creativity.
Self-creation. That's the other term. I think those are important distinctions, right? For how it is that we distinguish between versions of pantheistic paganism and I think what we would generally most would consider to be classical theism. Or traditional theism of some sort. Those would be clear distinctions, I think, that are important.
I mean, back at the worldview level, and I put this in my book, and one of the middle road, or the attempted middle road between the two throughout the centuries, and Christian theologians have wrestled with this as well. I'm thinking particular of people like John Scotus Erigena, not Duns Scotus, but the earlier medieval theologian. Other Christian theologians like maybe Meister Eckhart or some of the mystical theologians, is the attempt to work out this middle metaphysical ground between theism and pantheism, which oftentimes is called panentheism.
Yeah.
Right. Which, I think Goff has used the term panentheism in one of his discussions or debates, maybe the one with William Lane Craig. I think he trotted out the term panentheism, which I think most historians of philosophy would sort of relate back to Plotinus and the Plotinian kind of theory of emanation, that maybe the world is not contiguous or coterminous with God. God exceeds, or the divine exceeds the world in some way, but there is also nothing like a creation ex nihilo event where you have God existing apart from or sans creation.
Yeah.
But that the creation is sort of like eternally emanating from or out of God, or out of, in Plotinus's terms, the one, right?
So then the divine has penetrated everything.
Yeah, the way I'm putting it, and Josh, I'd like your input on this, because there are neo-pagans who reject that metaphysics. Michael York, especially, and others, probably Graham Harvey as well. They just make a hard distinction between that panentheistic idea of nature emanating out of the deity, as opposed to nature just being divine, right? And there's a couple reasons why, because one of the primary one is, on a lot of the emanationist views, historically speaking, whether it be something like maybe Plotinus's system or Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic kind of view, there are degrees then in the divine, in this hierarchy. There's this chain of being, right? So that there are beings that are of sort of lower value, right? And then there's being that is of a higher value. And of course, whenever you have sort of gradations to anything, then this sort of alters the teleology of the person, right? Where the idea then is to sort of ascend up the ladder of being to higher and higher states of being. And they don't like that idea because it would seem to diminish matter in a sense. They want all of the material realm to be fully imbued with divinity, and there not to be these sort of like value distinctions within the sort of the Godhead or within the divine. So I think panentheism is off the table for a lot of contemporary neo-pagans who are, want to hold on to that pure kind of pantheistic conception of the goddess, right? Where everything's divine, shot through with divinity, and we're not making sort of value judgments about divine nature, or within divine nature. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's helpful. Yeah, I think that's right. There are these. Yeah, I think that emanationist view is distinct from where a lot of neo-pagans are. So they would still make a distinction between lower life forms, nature itself, physical things, as having some sort of lower being on the hierarchy. Yeah, I mean, all of this is really. I can see the temptation, the metaphysical kind of temptation to move in these various directions. And I saw it certainly in Germany with my more religiously inclined kind of colleagues. Most of them over there were pretty, Roman Catholics they're pretty like beholden to some kind of panentheism mixed with panpsychism. And they're also very tempted toward kind of a glorification of nature itself. The boundaries do get blurry. And so even as we're talking, I'm trepidatious about this. I'm certainly sympathetic to the kind of the mystical traditions within Christianity. I think with many of them, they retain a clear creator-creature distinction in how they're experiencing mystical encounters. So I'm slow, I'm hesitant, but I would be reticent to put them in the category of pagan where they're divinizing and worshiping nature itself. But I say that with some hesitation.
Yeah. Well, and some of the mystical writings of like Eckhart, or I'm trying to think of
Eckhart is
Burma. Was it Jacob Burma? Was he the Christian or a Jewish? But I
think Eckhart's a clearer case, right? I think he's certainly more heretical.
Yeah, I mean, he was, in Copleston still believes at the end of the day that Eckhart was not affirming pantheism, but that's more that just the language, this poetic language that the mystics would write in, just seems to sort of maybe confuse creator and creation. It tends towards this praise of the creation that can come off as pantheistic. But at the end of the day, if one had pressed Meister Eckhart on what he actually believed doctrinally and in more clear propositional terms, that he still would have affirmed the creation distinction, et cetera, so on and so forth. And so I don't know, but it does seem to be that we would have to say, at least in this mystical tradition, where certainly want to kind of affirm spiritual theology throughout
Yeah.
the church's history in some way, and that experiential component, obviously, of God and the sort of maybe his design in the world, not right, and his presence, the presence of the Holy Spirit in the world, that there is a caution that needs to be a cautionary tale there as well, right? That one has to be careful. One has to be careful.
Yeah, so a few thoughts are coming to my mind. Some different things are hitting me, and maybe Joshua, you could speak to this, and that is there a I'm going to use the word correspondence. I'm going to use it intentionally. Is there a correspondence between panpsychism and Swedenborg's concept of the universal correspondences? I know Swedenborg took it from the perspective of there is a God who is distinct, but yet at the same time there are these correspondences between your thoughts, your inner experience, and those correspondences then reach into the spiritual plane, into the heavenly plane, even right into the very aspect of God himself. Is there a maybe it's just a loose connection, but a connection between panpsychism and Swedenborg's theory of the, or not theory, his belief in the sense of universal correspondences, which of course is a new thought concept as well. I mean, New Thoughtism is loaded with this idea of let's say you think it and you believe it, it happens because there's a correspondence that takes place. There is this connection pseudo-spiritually, pseudo-materialistically between what your thought process is and then the outcome that is derived because of it.
Manifesting.
Yes, thank you, Anthony.
Well,
thank
and
you.
I'll
Bingo.
just a little historical. I just read this yesterday. William James's father was a Swedenborgian.
Oh yes, that's right too. He was absolutely he was. In fact, I believe he was the leader in the Swedenborg church on campus.
And Joshua, you mentioned James in your introduction, so
right.
Yeah.
I don't
That's a good
know. Are
question.
analytic philosophers of mind who propose panpsychism as an explanatory model, are they thinking in terms of this kind of correspondence as well, where we can, I don't know, would it be like access or, and that would be a form of controlling of these other entities that have mental properties, right?
I just throwing it out there. I don't know. I mean, it's something I'm wondering about. So, and it brings me to two other areas then as well, and that is the realm of psychedelics, which is claiming to have a connection into consciousness that goes beyond what we understand, and the control of consciousness, or the accessibility of consciousness across the universe, not just simply internally. That is there. And then the other side that comes into play, the other question I have as well regarding consciousness and panpsychism, how then does this fit within models of artificial intelligence? Is it saying that the silicone is conscious, and maybe because the outcome of the silicone is an abstraction, AI being an abstraction, now the AI is not conscious, but the silicone behind it is?
Yeah. So okay. There's a lot of questions. So this would be like
accessing other than human, these other than human mental agents or conscious agents.
In every one of those examples, you would have that to some extent. Yes.
I think in cases of in many cases, panpsychists would affirm that is the case. I mean, cosmopsychism would say, and now that Philip Goff has moved in this direction, I'm not sure what his distinction is, how he's distinguishing cosmopsychism from Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism. But but they would both affirm something like the idea that our consciousness is not um, uh, substantial in a hard sense. It's not individualized. So there is I think there is a question, or there is at least a question, and this is certainly an important question for panpsychists in terms of can they preserve individual personhood, strictly speaking, or is consciousness, individual consciousnesses themselves, like with Bernardo Kastrup, are these really folds or alters in the ultimate consciousness, of which, for somebody like Kastrup, the universe itself is fundamentally mental, and what that means is whatever we mean by life is conflated with life and divinity itself. And so there is a sense in which there is, it's at least epistemically possible to have access across different consciousnesses for them. So I think many panpsychists would move in that direction. A lot of them are not asking quite this question, right? So, but some of them are. So I think that is part of the panpsychist literature. It would seem to be an entailment from some kind of cosmopsychism, the way that both Goff and Kastrup are defining it. And but Kastrup quite clearly moves in a much more deterministic direction. So he embraces a kind of fatalism. So this raises the question certainly about individual subjectivity as well as moral responsibility and freedom of the will and the like. And he embraces a kind of fatalism. He says that's the logical outcome and we should embrace it, and we shouldn't be depressed about it. Goff, I'm not sure. I think there's something distinct here. I think that's a really important question about who was it that you were mentioning? Swedenborg. Yeah, I think that's an important one that needs to be explored a bit more in this context. I'm not sure. I would say, but I do want to make one distinction with someone like Augustine in his epistemology. I think for Augustine, of course, looking back at the Confessions, he's doing the kind of Platonic thing of turning inward. How do we gain access to knowledge about the world and God himself? There has to be some kind of turn inward. But what he's recognizing in the turn inward is this Christian idea that the image is somehow impressed upon the soul. And so the fingerprint of God is present there. That's what we're looking toward. And by looking to the image becomes a source of knowledge itself or information about the cosmos. But I don't think that translates necessarily into this, how did you put it, this kind of epistemic access across consciousnesses themselves, to where you could have a cult-like power over other individualized consciousnesses. Does that make...
Yeah. Well, so sorry about that. Just thinking in terms of just what the word itself means, panpsychism. Psyche refers, of course, to the soul. And pan is all. So this is all soulism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which very much is very close to the definition of animism. Many have defined animism as the extension of soul to all physical reality.
Oh, that was going to be a question. Is panpsychism just another animism? Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, and
yeah.
I think they're at least that sound very close to me. I mean, I was just reading today a book by it's already a 20-year-old book by Douglas Cohen, called Cyberhenge, about the early days of neo-pagans and stuff on the internet and engagement with computer technology and so on and so forth. And he references some witches, online Wiccans in the early 2000s. We're not just treating the virtual space of the internet as a means to share information about magic and incantation, or to sort of come out of the broom closet as witches, where maybe they felt they couldn't do that at home in their Christian communities. But they were treating the hardware itself, the computer, the mouse, the screen, right, as agents, right? So that the one woman was like, don't get angry with your computer. Don't hit it. Don't scream at it. Don't yell at it when it malfunctions. Because it's a soulish entity. Those are my words, but it's the computer, the thing right in front of you, the screen, the mouse, the keyboard, every part of it is agency. Right? It's alive. It may even have feelings. Or if not that itself, maybe another way that you can show it is at least a conduit for the spirits. Right? It is at least a conduit for, the computer elves or whatever. I'm serious. This is the way it's conceived of. So, I mean, that does seem fairly close to this more analytic description of maybe fundamental particles being conscious or being proto-conscious, or the aggregate of them as taking on sort of conscious life. They do seem very close to me.
There is a fitting relationship, right? Yeah. With psychedelic experiences, there's this underlying assumption that the ego is ultimately dissolves or dissolues, dissolution, can experience dissolution in something ontologically bigger, the cosmic waters of consciousness.
Right.
Unity within the cosmos is presumed. That's why we can have these access to consciousnesses across, even outside of our own altered consciousness. And the living universe itself is conscious, and we as consciousnesses are just folds or something like folds in the wider consciousness itself. And so that's why we're connected to it. And psychedelics help us to, or can help us to, realize that fact. So the question then is, I mean, there's something going on with psychedelics in consciousness, and it is fitting with panpsychism, because there is a presupposition that oftentimes, at least, that underlying intrinsic to the natural physical world itself, that it is alive and conscious, and that we have a connection to it. So there's a very, very clearly a natural affinity there. I guess the question with psychedelics that's important here, I'm not sure how to answer this, is, do altered states reveal ontology, or do they alter perception in some way that is, I'm not sure how to put it, real or false or illusory? Certainly there's something going on. Does it reveal ontology? And I'm not sure. Well,
but before we get on to the psychedelics, we'll let Carl go a little bit on that. But a lot of what we just talked about, epistemic access to other entities, other conscious entities. I mean, that is just a big part of high magic itself. I mean, that is basically what the shaman does in pre-modern societies in the context of the ecstatic ritual.
So we got to make it. Yeah, we got to make that distinction as well. Even if it is real, maybe. I'm not sure how we articulate real or illusory in this context with respect to magic, but also the other distinction is, even if it is real, it doesn't mean that we should do it.
Right.
Yes. Right.
Yes. Well, let me just say what the shaman or the village, what the shaman, and this is from Eliada's huge book on shaman, what the shaman at least believes he's doing, right, is accessing other, either accessing other named conscious entities, the gods, right? Or is traveling or traversing through other regions of divine space, right? So he's in coming in and getting into the shamanic trance. The experience, at least, or what is thought to be an experience of, is sort of like opening oneself up to the broader divine space that is the god or the goddess, or what I'm calling just divine nature, and having experiences, so gaining access to things that in your normal state you're not experiencing, you're not accessing. But then, so there's the techne, there's the means, the magical means by which at least these experiences can be had. Now, then the question comes, is ontology being revealed, or is this just is this just hallucination? Are there just chemical things going on in the brain that are making you think that you are having experiences of other metaphysical experiences or ontological experiences?
Or does it have to be that simplistic? I mean, I'd be reticent to say it's not real. I mean, you gain certain kinds of information doing these things that's real information. It's true, at least. It's true information. I mean, when the biblical example of Saul that goes to the Witch of Endor, I mean, I take it literally. There's something that's going on there. And he gains certain information in encountering the spirit in a way. It was certainly wrong for him to do that. It was condemned and by the law to use that the means of doing that. But there does seem to be something real going on there. To what extent? I don't know. This is above my pay grade.
Well, I mean, I think we have a biblical framework in which all of this fits. But I just wanted to make the point about what is part of the magical project, the project and the endeavor of magic over the years is not much different than what some of these panpsychists maybe are now entertaining. So it could be just an explanatory model on one sense for how we can maybe crack the hard problem of consciousness. But then beyond that, well, what else might that, how do we take that a little bit further if we then really start to think that there are, the universe is a conscious agent? Well, then how can we access other parts of the universe that will give us these more expanded experiences? Right. Yes. But I'll let Carl.
These are being discussed. Yeah. Goff has recently been discussing these issues as well.
And you can even say it seems kind of natural to want those kinds of experiences. We want to sort of have the more grand view of reality, and whatever means we can use to get that. Yeah. If you're not a Christian, then maybe that's what you pursue. It's rational maybe to pursue that.
Yeah. So I think on the psychedelic side, we have there's a complexity behind it. It's not just simply this or that setup. So I think number one, it is accessing. There is the potential is there to access something on the other side, to access some form of spiritual entity or to have some type of spiritual experience. The potential is there. There's a setup there. At the same time, there is a neurochemical reality that's taking place. It is affecting your neurochemical balance, your chemistry, your neurological makeup in such a manner that it is disassociating yourself with your own reality. It's taking you into a different reality. All of a sudden, let's say, the walls breathe. My dog looks like an elephant. There's rabbits running up the wall. I mean, I've just described a few things that my friends have described as they have gone through different experiences using psychedelics. The plants take on a whole different color, a complexity, they're breathing. But some of that may just simply be neurological mix-ups, neurological composition, and then the issue of set and setting. This is so important in the psychedelic world to have the right set and setting. And when I consider the whole issue of set and setting, it immediately lands in the realm of suggestibility. And so psychedelics brings a suggestibility to play. So what I mean by set and setting is you want to make sure that your room, your space, your physical space, the ambiance fits the mode. It fits the experience. So maybe you'll have a little Buddha statue in the corner. You'll have some candles. Yeah. Somebody that's going to be there to sit with you, hold your hand, and walk you through it. Now all of a sudden you've opened up a certain conduciveness for suggestibility. And that is there. When you have bad trips, it seems that you're in a set and setting that it's more sterile. It's more, it doesn't fit the mode of the good trip. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that in terms of psychedelics, we've got a complexity going on. It definitely, there's more than just simply one or two things. There may be potential for many things happening at the same time. Suggestibility, obviously neural connections, a chemistry of a flow, and then the potential for that to somehow open your consciousness to something else on the other side. So I'm, in terms of the psychedelic angle, that's kind of where my head was at listening to that part of our little dialogue, and then back to animism really quickly. So I was at a witchcraft event. This is a year or two ago. The lady giving the talk, she was a witch, and she was giving a talk, and she was animistic, and she brought her animism out, and it was in the morning. She had her styrofoam cup with coffee. And she acknowledged the spiritual particles or the spiritual principle within the coffee itself. And then she said, if I believe this, I have to believe that the styrofoam has a consciousness. And then she took the lid off and she goes, I have to actually believe that this lid has a consciousness. Now, what do I do with the lid? I'm sitting there going, you've just wrapped your whole life up into a pile of knots over this. If everything has a certain element of consciousness, if everything has some sense of sentience, maybe not sentience, but some proto-consciousness or spark of consciousness, or let's call it the spark of the divine, if you want to go from the cosmos side, the higher side down. Then don't throw your coffee cup lid in the trash and be so disrespectful.
Yeah, I think that gives a very concrete example of maybe the difference between the pantheist and maybe somebody who's got a more Gnostic or panentheistic view. Because the panentheist would be, well, this is being, this coffee cup is maybe it's of the same kind of being as the one, but it's of a much lower grade of being or degree,
lower vibration or frequency or something.
It may even be sort of corrupted being, right? So it's less important you can acknowledge, you still throw it in the garbage though. But that woman, I think that woman and these women that I mentioned, who are talking about their computer screens and their computer keyboards, they're being more consistent animists, right? Which makes which starts to get into very ethically tricky waters.
For sure. But I mean, of course, and so it's all right. I'm going to throw a political economic spin on this. Then, so is the coffee cup lid more? Maybe it's more evil because. Or has a lower or degraded sense of being because it was created through a capitalistic system?
That's something to think about.
And because socialism is more of a collective form of activity, that maybe if we had collectively built the coffee cup lid,
the means by which this aggregate of conscious entities was put together, the means exactly
determine
in some way its value.
Determines the value. Yeah.
Yeah.
Josh,
Yeah.
Joshua, we need to kick it back to you, though.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, that's fun. We gotta laugh a little bit. I'm not sure where to take that exactly, but it's funny. I think
Maybe
there
we
are
bring it
close
back
affinities.
to panpsychism, though, in the academic literature, though, because I think, I don't know if you wanted to make any critique of what, or at least it was so far of like whether or not this actually solves the hard problem of consciousness, or then also present maybe a more the better model of substance dualism. Which has been the focus of much of your own work.
Yeah. So, there's a lot you just asked there. I think there's a few things to. Yeah, I think we've been talking about certainly a lot of the close affinity between panpsychism and versions of monism, pantheism, panentheism, the possibility of a distinction between kind of an emanationism and the relationship that has, or the implications that has in the context of how we understand consciousness, to magic, psychedelics, and the like, and the questions that are kind of alive at some level. I think we've talked about some of those things. But I should say on one side, it's important to understand, which I was, the narrative of these neuroscientific philosophical discussions of consciousness and how it's developed in terms of coming out of explicitly naturalistic and secularistic frameworks or worldviews. And I think that's important. And then the trajectory that it lends itself to in terms of what discussions are taking place today, in terms of what Goff is even talking about himself very explicitly when he invokes or talks about pantheism, Gaia, these other things, and the affinity this has in terms of the affinity it has with other pagan or even Eastern worldviews. That's important to highlight in our age of feminization. Can I say that? I'll get in trouble.
No, you can say it.
In our age of feminization, this is much more acceptable and a palatable theism, if we even could call it theism. It's a much more palatable theism, softer theism that is acceptable, rather than having this robust kind of classical view of God, where God is actually transcendent, the creator, wherein these worldviews seem to be controlling or codifying God in a way that makes God immanent, almost solely immanent, where the nature is alive and deified even. Goff even talks in these kind of superlative or these ways about nature, almost in a deified way. It has these attributes itself that's deified. God is a consciousness field. God is a unity. God is a universal life. And so this kind of very clearly and very quickly, it seems to me, and I don't think I'm moving too quickly to this, hopefully not, analysis. It very quickly constrains or places limitations on the nature of God himself into a commodified box that is safe and friendly in our feminized world. Yeah. I just said that.
You just said it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the feminized world that has carried over into our feminized church. So
That's right.
I'll take it one step.
Our very feminized church. That's why we're more agreeable to pagan ideologies and these sorts of things, because we are so feminized.
So let me take you down a rabbit trail with this. This connection between the feminizing and paganism. When we speak of God as masculine, is it because God is not male or female? We know that. we speak of God in the male. He wants to be referred to in the male. We speak about God as he because it represents or symbolizes God's externalization, the creative process. It's all external. He is doing an outward work. It's no longer confined to within the Trinity. There is an outpouring of his activity beyond himself, which is a male characteristic. Mm-hmm. That's how men are wired. We're wired to build outward. We're wired to do things externally. Every aspect of our being kind of fits that mold. Right. We want to do something. We want to construct things. Even our sexuality is externalized. Uh-huh. Then when we consider the feminine nature, it's more of an internalization. It is more of a sense of nurturing. It is more of a sense of an internal experience. There is a more of an emotional quality to it. Even the sexual reproductive aspect of it is all internal. We cannot call God an it, because God is not a force. God is a personality. Yeah. So we're really left with only one of two things. God is either framed and described as externalizing himself, being him, he, male, or internalized, which is female, the sense of the goddess. Mm-hmm. So, it's an interesting kind of a thought process. Why do we call God he versus her? And so I know the argument is simply, well, because the Bible says, but there is more going on beneath the surface, and I think it's fitting when we ask the question of how our culture is feminized, or churches have become feminized, because the sense is now we are now having this internalized experience. We are having this internalized reality without landing it on an external truth. So God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is the external truth. But I'm going to frame my spiritual experiences with what I internally now encounter. The mystical sense, the experiential sense versus the external truth standard sense. Is this making sense?
Yeah, no, I think it's right. I think it's hard to deny that when you start looking at the way that and start even pressing the question of the rationale for why God is referred to in that way. I mean, there are many evangelical theologians today that would say it's totally arbitrary, and that we could actually, even if we don't, and even if we haven't throughout most of her history, the church, if we even believe in the church, universal, Catholic, not Roman Catholic necessarily, but Catholic, if we believe in Catholic Church, right, in some real sense, even though she hasn't referred to him quite commonly as her, many theologians would say we certainly could, and there are even attributes in Scripture that or characteristics that we could refer to, like, for example, he's referred to as kind of a hen that collects, but even though we haven't referred to him in that way in terms of describing or using she language, I think there's another side to this that really buttresses what Carl is saying, and I think there's a lot to that. When we even begin to press the rationale at all, there's an underlying sort of nature and design by way of God's creation of human creatures and how it is that we're ordered. There is a hierarchy, I think, intrinsic in the creation that is important and even good. Now I'm going to get in trouble for that, but that's okay. I affirm it. I think it's true. I think it's deeply scriptural.
Don't worry, it's okay. The tide is shifting. We're winning now.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Doug Wilson just preached at the Pentagon, so don't worry.
Yeah, we're okay. Well, if Doug Wilson can preach there, we're good. Masculine Christianity is on the rise again. But I think buttressing that with Christological rationale, we could even go that direction. I mean, I think there's a rationale for Christology as being male,
Yep.
the leadership, even within the context of the ecclesial organization, as representative of Christ himself in Ephesians 5, predicated upon the whole dynamic of the husband-wife as the type of the order of the ecclesial family, I think is deeply embedded in the ecclesial design itself. That opened up just a whole can of worms there, I know. But I think we could take it that direction, but we should probably get back to panpsychism at some point. But I think that's basically right. Yeah, I think that's right.
No, that's right. Well, and it should be pointed out, I'll point out real quickly that with regards to paganism, though, there's nothing necessarily inherent in paganism that says that one has to construe the divine nature as in feminine terms. Certainly could be that you have neo-pagan groups that embrace the masculine side polarity in nature, and they might handle themselves and act in the world differently based on their embrace of that aspect of divine nature than the more feminized groups. And they might act quite differently from those that embrace the feminine conception or the feminine aspect of the divine nature. And they might be something to watch out for in the near future.
So there is layers of complexity within the pagan world. There's no question. Lots of complexity. Yeah.
And because we are seeing now very recently reactions to the divine feminine and the feminization of the church.
Right.
But they're coming from a very pagan kind of mindset, right? Much more Nietzschean and Homeric.
Yes.
Right. And that is what I'm thinking of, right?
There are some important weaknesses in panpsychism and panintheism or pantheism. There's some important weaknesses that I think are arbitrary or artificial ways of propping up secularism that I think are important to highlight, that a theist who I think theism entails dualism at one level, at least in terms of the creator-creature as well as the soul-body relationship, that does a better job of explaining the data. So going back to the kind of narrative of coming out of naturalistic secularism and its physicalist entailment, as the narrative shifts and people become aware of their disillusionment with physicalism as an explanatory kind of framework for consciousnness, and paralleled with that, they become disenchanted, you might say, with nature as the likes of Megan O'Geeblin, great book right there. I love the book. I mean, I highly recommend it. Fascinating book. But she becomes kind of disenchanted with kind of physicalism because of consciousness. I mean, we need to explain consciousness, and consciousness is what makes the world go round and makes it interesting. What you have in panpsychism, I think, is an arbitrary kind of imposition of consciousness that we do have access to upon everything else that we either do have access to its interior nature as just the externalized properties of what it is that we can publicly observe and empirically investigate, or we are confronted with a fundamental kind of metaphysical problem. I think this is a problem. That this is the analogy, this is often called by philosophers the analogy of the mind problem, that becomes kind of problematic for panpsychism, or most versions of panpsychism. It's an epistemic problem that I think leads to other metaphysical implications that theistic dualism does a better job with. So if we're following the epistemologist Richard Firmerton closely, and I think his core insight is basically right, that knowledge by acquaintance is foundational to our knowledge of the world. The only thing that we are directly acquainted with is our own conscious experience. Phenomenological, so his view is often called phenomenological dualism. Epistemically, we're in this epistemic stance where we are at least acquainted with our own consciousness experience. We know that the material exists, or even our body exists, and other bodies exist, but we only know in a mediated way or an indirect way by way of our first person consciousness experience. I know that my body exists, but it's only mediated by my conscious experience of myself, where I am aware of, or I have access to my own mental states or conscious states of being and experiencing the world. And so I have a direct acquaintance, arguably, with my own conscious experience, and an indirect acquaintance with even my body. Now, so if something like that is right, that I have immediate awareness or access to my mental states, that external reality itself, the physical reality, that's really, truly publicly observable, but predicated upon first-person conscious awareness, then that external reality is inferred in some way. It's at least indirect or mediated in some way by my first-person experiences. That doesn't mean that I don't have genuine knowledge of it, true knowledge, I do, but it's mediated nonetheless. If that's right, then panpsychism does come into a kind of fundamental problem, kind of epistemic problem, in terms of actually they have access to their own minds, and in order to make sense of, or to posit or prop up some kind of naturalistic explanation of how the world functions, say, for example, making sense of fine-tuning, well, they have to import or imbue some kind of mental consciousness that provides some sort of teleology to the world itself by way of mental explanations or mental events themselves that are fundamental to the organization or the self-organization of the universe. But the problem is there's this gap between the access that I have of my own mind and the access that I have to the particle's mind at the fundamental level. So as a dualist, I would just say, no, we have access to it, at least indirectly, and the publicly observable properties or events of the physical world itself are what it is. And we don't need to posit this additional, which is what panpsychism is prone to do, in order to get off the ground some kind of naturalistic explanation of the world. They have to posit this additional mental set of properties or mind-like properties at the lower levels in order to explain how the world operates. As a theistic dualist at one level, like, I don't have to do this because I recognize that the properties of physical things are publicly observable. They can be studied. You can empirically investigate them, and they give at least at one level a sufficient explanation for what they are. Now, if in fact they are minded or mental, I don't have direct access to them, and there is something that is not only mysterious. I would say theism at one level is mysterious. This is a different kind of mystery, though. And I don't think all mysteries are on the same level in terms of explaining what we need to explain in the world or what we can actually explain. It doesn't explain in as deep a way as theism does. They have to posit something extra, add it to kind of physical particles at the fundamental level to make sense of the world, that which they don't actually have access to. So it's it's an add-on to the system to try to make the empirical method metaphysically what you might say, metaphysically supportable for sufficiently explaining the universe without recourse to theism.
Yeah, right.
Right? So it's an
just
add-on to the system that's unnecessary, arbitrary, and when they do that, they don't actually have access to the mentality of particles themselves.
So it's just,
so there's this irresolvable gap, right? As a result of, this analogy of the mind, there's this irresolvable gap, and it's an unnecessary postulation. Now, Goff would want to say, well, there's mysteries on every view, right? Every worldview. Theism has mysteries. Classical theism can't explain suffering. He's rhetorically, he's very effective at this. I mean, he already sounds like a New Age guru, and that's what makes him so palatably like, I hear that, I believe it. But like he tries to make this case that every system or worldview has problems.
Yeah.
And that's true. We can grant that. Okay. You might grant that theism has a problem, or at least more challenge in terms of explaining the problem of evil, maybe at one level. But I think what the difference is that when you postulate a mysterious explanation in order to prop up your whole system, you're doing something completely ad hoc. When as a theist, down the line, we can say, yeah, suffering is kind of a problem. Now we can provide some sort of explanatory stories to motivate why suffering and evil actually exists in the world, right? We have defenses, and we have theodicies that we can say. We're not positing an extra mystery to prop up our whole kind of worldview system as theists.
So the move seems ad hoc.
Yeah.
Adding a mystery.
Yeah.
For the sake of maintaining the naturalistic metaphysics that you want to maintain.
Yeah.
Is that correct? So you add this mystery,
I think so. Yeah, that's right.
Of proto-consciousness, another kind of consciousness that you have no access to.
Right. Yeah.
And I would say, like, maybe another motivating factor to do this.
Yeah.
Because again, it raises this question: why do you want to maintain? What is motivating the desire to maintain the naturalistic metaphysics?
Yeah.
The naturalistic framework.
Yeah.
And I'm sure most won't admit that. Although I think Thomas Nagel did kind of admit something like this, that there's a moral component. There's a moral reason for wanting to maintain the naturalistic framework, because this cosmic agency, this cosmic agent is not really issuing moral commands to us.
Right.
That we are then obligated to follow. And also, if the whole thing is taken into account,
right.
There may be some kind of teleology to it. But I don't know that there's the kind of also a design that we can discern that would say this is the proper use for this object of nature, and this is an improper use for this object of divine nature. So that it does seem to me like, to go back to Romans 1:18-32, even though maybe people aren't willing to admit it, that there are sort of suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. There are moral reasons for why one would want to, even if it seems ad hoc, sort of just posit mental entity or, mentality in the universe itself, because it would be a way to avoid or escape, the, as Adam Smith, I think, put it, the shackles of revealed religion, right? Something like that. Does that make sense, or does that?
Yeah, no, I think
want to
that's,
go there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, they're using a kind of brute explanation, or you might call it a mystery, to explain the mystery of consciousness in a way that is unnecessary, ad hoc. I think there are very likely underlying motivations, especially if we already operate clearly within a Christian worldview or even a biblical worldview. Then Romans 1, it would make a lot of sense, natural sense, that Romans 1 is kind of in the background of even, dare we say, like metaphysical metaphysical systems, and why people
metaphysical modeling.
Yeah, modeling. Why it is that we would model certain metaphysical views of the world the way that we do. Certainly there are underlying impulses and motivations, and I think that's clear with panpsychism in some cases, in many cases. And you're right to bring up Thomas Nagel. I'm trying to think of the book
where he talks about
like religion. He even says, like, I don't want to believe in
we
God.
wouldn't want to believe in that God. Yeah, right. He says it.
Yeah. Which book was that? I have it written down somewhere, but it's one of his books. I mean, he has several lines where he's very direct, like, I wouldn't want to believe in him. So there's do seem to be underlying motivations.
I mean, I know we don't like to go there in academic discourse. We don't want to assume that part of Romans 1:18 through 32 is true when we're engaging with our interlocutors, and that, in fact, maybe they are just suppressing the truth in unrighteousness and not just sort of like ignorance or something.
I think that's right. I mean, I love J.P. Moreland's, I think it was an underappreciated book. It was the first, as I understand it, the first academic monograph to develop the argument from consciousness for God to God. His book, The Argument from Consciousness, his Rutledge book in 2008. I think it was a really unappreciated book. And he works through different views, and he works even through Scribina's kind of panpsychist view in there, his panpsychist explanation of consciousness. And then he gets to the end and he makes this move himself. And I think there's a lot more that could be there's a lot more bells and whistles that could be done to develop his moral kind of argument. He gets around to a moral framework at the end of the argument from consciousness, and he says this is the reason why these thinkers, who are not all physicalists, he's including Scribina and others, the reason why they don't want to accept theism, a personal theism of any sort, is because it lends itself to this moral entailment. And so he tries to develop that argument at the end of his book in a kind of a pretty short, concise way. And I think he's right. I think that's right. I think that argument needs to be developed more in this context of the argument from consciousness. I think that's probably right. I mean, to build on, and we could bring it around to a close. I mean, we could build on this epistemic problem that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. There's the whole combination problem. There's a variety of different combination objections to panpsychism. There's an epistemic problem that's in kind of the ballpark of what we were just talking about with respect to Fumerton and the kind of irresolvable gap for the panpsychist with respect to the analogy of the mind. But this becomes a bigger epistemic problem when we do posit those brute explanations to prop up the mystery of consciousness. And that is that if there are these underlying micro experiences that are necessary to form or to comprise or combine to form macro experience, mm-hmm. namely us or you and I individually, then we have a further irresolvable problem, it seems, epistemically, in terms of being not being acquainted, like metaphysically in principle, not being able to be acquainted with the micro subjects inside of us that give rise to the macro subject or macro experience that is us. And so it at least puts us in a state of epistemic agnosticism. And I think this is part of Fumerton's argument that he doesn't develop fully in his book, Knowledge and the Case for Dualism, against panpsychism. He touches on it briefly, but it lends itself to a problem that is epistemically irresolvable.
Insurmountable problem.
Insurmountable. Yeah, that's the right word.
Problem
a kind of epistemic agnosticism.
Right.
A pure kind of agnosticism. We just can't know. But we do seem to know. And what it is that we know, we have direct access to, and that's our phenomenological experience, our conscious experience. Yeah. And that is something I think we can be certain of. We can have access to. And by way of knowing that, we can know other things in the world, particularly physical things. We can know other things about the world. And the empirical method gets off the ground then, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we've achieved, I feel like we've achieved a goal here in which confirmed my suspicion a few years back when I was at that Discovery Institute conference and already thinking a little bit about paganism and whether or not it was reemerging in the culture. And of course, knowing that fundamentally most pagan religions are animistic in their conception of the material world. It's, the corporeal spiritual outlook that I could see the unreflective animist who's just, out at Burning Man or Paganicon or some festival in the woods, going through their rituals, acknowledging the deity, acknowledging the various deities around them, the rock, the stone, the coffee cup and the coffee lid.
Yeah.
But then maybe saying, boy, I have an intellect. I want to put it to use. I wonder if there's sort of arguments or sort of more academic or scholarly resources that I might draw from to sort of defend what I'm doing in case anybody ever challenges me about, do you really believe this stuff? And I thought, well, panpsychism seems to at least be, for this type of person, if they were to go look for a philosophy of mind, some literature on this, I could see them picking up a basic, maybe Chalmers or somebody else or some other panpsychist and say, oh, well, this seems to kind of support what I've been doing all these years out in the woods and making my acknowledgments of the fairies and the elves and the various other creatures that I think inhabit the material substrate, the macro object that I see, the rock or the tree and everything. So I could see that person saying, well, okay, there's a whole bunch of academic literature. So, and these are really smart folks. So I must be on the right track with my polytheistic or animistic worship and practice.
Yeah. No, I think your intuition is right. And I think we're seeing it kind of play out in further developments in the discussion on panpsychism, and where many panpsychists already are, and even where Philip Goff, the way he's developing his understanding of the cosmos and theism itself, even, it is a kind of animism revived, it seems. A complex animism revived that has some credential to it.
Right.
But I think there is a fundamental question underlying this discussion. And I want to be in my purely academic mind, if I'm going to be really, really charitable, I mean, is it possible to affirm a kind of panpsychism and still be a theist? Maybe. there's at least maybe one example I can think of who's trying to do this. But what's interesting is even with her, she's a theist panpsychist, trying to be more classical.
About, yeah. Right.
Even with her, the way she develops the view, it is actually quite dualistic in the way she develops it. It looks like substance dualism and a kind of theistic dualism at the end of the day. And it's certainly not operating out of the normal, common kind of naturalistic and secular story, although the motivations might be there. And we could look into that further and analyze that. But I just want to put that on the side, shelve it for a moment. But I think the real question is, are you, on theistic dualism, you are. Are you a unified, enduring, rational soul, or a temporary kind of eddy in the cosmic mentality, the cosmic mind, as it were? Are you an eddy or an altar?
Yeah.
I think panpsychism is certainly, as it's being developed quite clearly by many practitioners or those committed to it, quite clearly hospitable to a kind of pantheistic world that is pagan. I think that's right. And it looks a lot less like traditional or classical Christian theism.
Yeah. You're kind of, you said an eddy, right? Like in a river, in the cosmic river of consciousness, you swirl, the swirl comes together.
Right.
Which almost starts to sound like, wasn't the Stoics who had the view of the swerve? Was it the swerve?
Yeah.
Stoicism? So, I mean, yeah. And we would want to say no, that there's a real there, right?
Right.
A substance that is not just phasing in and phasing out,
right.
In the cosmic one, but that God is created and endowed with a real ontological integrity.
Right. I think that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
The beautiful thing, though, about this conversation is, and what struck me even about halfway through, is the world is wrestling through fundamental issues of consciousness, what it means to be placed within reality. And then for us as believers, then all of a sudden we're faced with the question of what is the soul. We're faced with all of a sudden the discussion of who is God. Mm-hmm. All of these land in our realm. And as the world is disenchanted, even with their own explanations, we're fortunate to land on the one who knows us and how incredibly complex we have been created, and that we land in the hands of the one who remains the same yesterday, today, and forever. Which I just love it, because it's we have, put it this way, we have the opportunity to engage in the conversation and to bring a totally different perspective in.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I think this has been a very successful episode here. I think it illuminated a lot for me, and it did confirm some of my inclinations from earlier as I go through this. And I would expect, so I hope that, we would say, like, we want some people in the academic world to take note of this, because I think this is coming. It's already here in a sense, but that I think we'll see more and more this intersection. And I'm saying I am seeing more academic defenses of by philosophers, some in using the analytic tradition, defending polytheism and polytheistic, pantheistic sort of conceptions of the world. So
yes,
you should expect more of that. Yeah.
Right.
All right, Father Farris.
Very good. It was good.
Excellent. It's good.
Good time.
Good. So thanks for everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799. or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.